Russian Federation, His Excellency Mr. Vladimir Tarabrin. You have the floor, Excellency.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Court, it's an honor for me to be representing the Russian Federation at these hearings. Seizing this opportunity, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, Madam Vice President, and all the new judges of the Court upon election to your respective positions. We trust that the Court, in its new composition, will continue making its immeasurable contribution to peaceful resolution of disputes and development of international law. Mr. President, the current proceedings originate in the adoption by the General Assembly of Resolution 77/247 back in December 2022. When adopting the resolution, the General Assembly was gravely concerned by the tension and violence in the recent period throughout the occupied Palestinian territories. The Assembly noted the continuing systematic violation of the human rights of the Palestinian people by Israel, the occupying power, including that arising from the excessive use of force and military operations causing death and injury to Palestinian civilians. The Assembly also spoke of the arbitrary imprisonment and detention of Palestinians, the use of collective punishment, the closure of areas, the confiscation of land, the establishment and expansion of settlements, the destruction of property and infrastructure, the demolition of Palestinian homes, the forced displacement of civilians, and the disastrous humanitarian situation and the critical socio-economic and security situation in the Gaza Strip. As has been stressed by numerous delegations speaking at these hearings, the situation on the ground has since deteriorated in a dramatic fashion. The Gaza Strip, since October 2023, has been an area of intense hostilities. This time, violence has taken an unprecedented and indeed a catastrophic scale. The overall number of victims during the current wave of violence, almost 30,000, has already surpassed the figure from any of the previous Arab-Israeli wars. Images from Gaza are terrifying. Indiscriminate airstrikes are killing civilians and erasing whole residential districts. More than half of all buildings in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed. Up to 90% of Gazans have been forced to leave their homes and are living in inhuman conditions. Against the backdrop of the tough Israeli blockade, the Gaza Strip is experiencing a genuine humanitarian catastrophe. Its inhabitants are suffering from an acute shortage of food, medication, and fuel. Access to sources of clean water has been limited, resulting in a spread of infectious diseases. Over 20% of agricultural lands have been damaged and will never be recultivated. Mr. President, Russia, of all countries, understands the dangers of terrorism. We have faced this evil time and again. Let me use this opportunity to reiterate our heartfelt condolences to the Israelis who lost their loved ones in the attack on the 7th of October. Brutal massacre of innocent people, taking of hostages, and other terrorist violence do not have and cannot have any justification. We have repeatedly condemned such acts. Let me also stress that Russia highly values the stable relations that we enjoy with Israel. We are united by shared history of combating Nazism, as well as by a myriad of present-day human ties. Our cooperation is resilient in the face of geopolitical turbulence, and we are committed to its further development. Having said this, we are convinced that the tragic events of the 7th of October cannot justify the collective punishment of more than 2 million Gazans. We cannot accept the logic of those officials in Israel and some Western countries who try to defend the indiscriminate violence against civilians by referring to Israel's duty to protect its nationals. Violence can only lead to more violence. Hatred brings hatred. This vicious circle must be broken. In Russia's view, security both for Israel and the Palestinians can only be ensured if the root cause of the current crisis is addressed. Outbreaks of violence will inevitably occur again until the Palestinian people, having suffered for decades from injustice, exercises its right to establish an independent state. That state, in accordance with the Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, is to emerge within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Only this approach, based on international law, can bring a lasting peace for the region and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. This is the spirit that we have, that has been guiding Russia in fulfilling its responsibilities as a mediator between Palestine and Israel, notably as a member of the so-called Quartet, alongside the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union. The history of the conflict shows what happens when Security Council resolutions are ignored and influential global actors are incapable of or unwilling to help the parties find consensual solutions. Attempts to put the conflict into a low-intensity mode instead of a comprehensive settlement have time and again provoked eruptions in the occupied territories. The current wave of violence is no exception. It was preceded by a persistent policy of the United States and its allies aimed at freezing the status quo, watering down the political processes, promoting a one-sided vision of a settlement. Among the victims of such short-sighted and irresponsible approach was the quartet of mediators, those of mediators whose work has been effectively blocked by the United States. This flawed policy of Washington has predictably led to a failure that has cost thousands of innocent lives. Today, all responsible members of the international community are facing a difficult task of creating conditions to lead the situation out of the current impasse. After the violent phase has been overcome, the parties will need help in establishing a full-fledged political dialogue, allowing them to settle all disputes on the universally recognized international legal basis. Russia hopes that the advisory opinion of the court will contribute to achieving this goal. Mr. President, a lot has already been said in this hall on the numerous violations of international law by Israel. Russia supports the assessments given in the General Assembly Resolution 77/247 and the respective reports of the Secretary General. We also support relevant resolutions of the Human Rights Council based on the reports of its Special Rapporteur. In today's statement, let me focus on two of the most important aspects. The first one is the persistent denial by Israel of the right of Palestinians to self-determination. The right to self-determination through the establishment of an independent Palestinian state has been at the heart of efforts of the international community. This right has been recognized by the General Assembly, the Security Council, and by this court. It's worth recalling that the principle of self-determination of peoples is one of the foundations of the United Nations, mentioned in the very first article of its charter. Every state has the duty to refrain from any forcible action which deprives peoples of their right to self-determination. Meanwhile, as recognized by the General Assembly, the protracted Israeli occupation prevents the Palestinians from implementing that right. An end to the Israeli occupation has been identified as a goal for the international community by legally binding resolutions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2334. Israel is accordingly under an obligation to cease its violations of international law and to allow the Palestinian people to establish an independent state. This necessarily means that the occupation must come to an end. The other key problem that leads to continuous violations of human rights of Palestinians are the Israeli settlement activities. This policy, sometimes referred to as creation of facts on the ground, was launched back in 1967 and has led to progressive shrinking of Palestinian lands. This has effectively undermined prospects of a negotiated solution of the one element of the final status, namely the issues of territory and borders. The overall number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is over 700,000. The situation is exacerbated by other arbitrary moves by the Israeli authorities, such as confiscation of lands, demolition of homes, and prohibition of new construction. Most recently, this has been accompanied by violence emanating from Israeli settlers. In 2023, that is after the present request for an advisory opinion was made, the settlement activities of Israel have gained a record-breaking speed. Thus, according to the latest reports of the United Nations Secretary General, in 2023, plans for more than 700,000 housing units were advanced, approved, or tendered. This is more than double than 11,700 units in 2022, which in itself was a remarkable figure. During the current wave of violence, we have witnessed public statements by Israeli cabinet members announcing plans to resume settlement activities in the Gaza Strip. Thus, on the 28th of January 2024, at a conference in West Jerusalem, cabinet ministers openly called for deportation of Palestinians from Gaza and presented a map with 21 settlement blocks. One cannot help noting that the event was held 2 days after this court indicated provisional measures in the South Africa versus Israel case. The court agreed that the situation in Gaza poses risks of irreparable harm to the rights of Palestinians guaranteed by the Genocide Convention. This fact alone underscores the gravity of the situation. In this connection, it's worth recalling that this court, in its advisory opinion on the wall, recognized that the Israeli settlement in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, had been established in breach of international law. As explained in that advisory opinion, the settlements are contrary to the principle of inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by force. They also contradict the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, prohibiting transfers of population and deportations from an occupied territory. Resolutions of the Security Council have characterized that policy as changing the legal status and geographical nature of the occupied territories and materially affecting their demographic composition. In its resolution 2334, the Security Council reaffirmed that the settlements have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation under international law and a major obstacle to the achievements of the two-state solution and the just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. This policy is aggravated by numerous violations of other rules of international humanitarian law and human rights law. These include the right to life, to respect for private and family life, to property, to freedom of movement, to freedom of religion, to work, to health, to education, and to an adequate standard of living. As mentioned earlier, this policy continues unabated in defiance of Security Council resolutions and the Quartet roadmap. Importantly, as stressed in Resolution 2334, the settlements are dangerously imperiling the viability of the two-state solution based on the 1967 lines. They are thus also violating the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Israeli policies in Palestine, to Russia's deep regret, include other international law violations. Many examples have been provided by other delegations here. The Russian Federation expects the court to give them due consideration. Mr. President, members of the court, the question before us, therefore, the legal consequences of those violations. The starting point here is the well-established rule whereby every internationally wrongful act of a state entails the international responsibility of that state. In the present proceedings, the court will be right to conclude that Israel's violations result in Israel's duty to comply with the obligations it had breached, to put an end to its ongoing violations, and to provide reparation for the damage caused. This means, first and foremost, that Israel is under an international legal obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to stop all settlement activities in the occupied territory. Given the particular legal framework in the Middle East peace process, Israel is also under an obligation to cease all activities that impede reaching a final status agreement based on the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination in an independent, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Having said that, the court will be wise not to engage in a detailed discussion on the precise scope and forms of implementation of Israel's responsibility. This is important for two reasons. First, advisory proceedings before the court are not an exercise in implementation of responsibility. No state is invoking Israel's responsibility in these proceedings, as indeed Israel is precluded from invoking responsibility of others. A state may only be brought before this court on the basis of its own consent. Full respect for the principle of consent is of crucial importance for the integrity of international judicial procedures. Secondly, the international community has established a solid legal framework for the Middle East peace process. This legal framework is a universally recognized and a legally binding one. It contains crucial elements that effectively coincide with the aims of international responsibility. A negotiated two-state solution with an independent, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state peacefully coexisting with Israel will be the best recipe for bringing an end to Israel's violations, creating guarantees of their non-repetition, and redressing the damage. The advantage of the peace process is an idea of direct negotiations between Israel and Palestine. They are to reach an agreement on the basis of their free will. In Russia's opinion, that significantly strengthens the chances that an agreement will actually be achieved, will indeed satisfy the interests of both parties, and will be implemented in practice. The Russian Federation invites the court to be guided by the need to contribute to creating conditions for successful final status negotiations. The best contribution would be a confirmation by the court that Israel and Palestine are under an obligation to resume such negotiations, while all states and international organizations shall cooperate in order to make that possible. In its written statement, the Russian Federation has discussed the status of the court as one of the principal organs of the United Nations. The court has on many occasions recognized that its advisory opinions represent its participation in the activities of the organization. When asked by the General Assembly to provide an advisory opinion, the court should give an opinion that would indeed be useful for the Assembly. For these reasons, we respectfully submit that the court, when giving an advisory opinion in this case, should be guided by the principles of the peace process and should actively seek to give an opinion that would contribute to their implementation. Mr. President, today I will not dwell upon issues of jurisdiction, admissibility, applicable law, or interpretation of questions put by the General Assembly. The respective chapters of the written contribution of the Russian Federation retain their full relevance. Let me now summarize our submissions. The continued Israeli occupation of Palestine impedes the realization of the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination. Israeli settlements are contrary to the principle of inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by force. They also run counter to the prohibition of transfer and deportation of population of an occupied territory. The settlement activities are aggravated by numerous other violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. All states are under an obligation not to recognize the illegal situation resulting from Israel's violations. Israel shall terminate its breaches of international law. It must, in particular, cease all settlement activities and all other activities that impede reaching a final status agreement. At the same time, discussion on Israel's responsibility must remain within the limits imposed by the advisory nature of these proceedings and to the need to create conditions for successful final status negotiations. Israel and Palestine are under an obligation to conduct in good faith and without delay negotiations aimed at reaching a final status agreement. All states and international organizations are under an obligation to contribute to creating conditions for such negotiations. The agreement thus reached shall result in the implementation by the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination and emergence of an independent, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state, with East Jerusalem as its capital. This will bring an end to the ongoing violations of human rights of Palestinians and to the Israeli occupation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. President.